The club on West 52nd Street was supposed to be about music, not memory. It sat half a block from the neon arteries of Manhattan. A place where smoke curled like thought and glasses chimed with the soft impatience of men who believed they mattered. On most nights, the room hummed with laughter that came too easily. Money that spoke too loudly, and applause that often arrived before the song was finished. But on this night, something heavier lingered in the air and unease that no one could name yet. Dean. Martin arrived without announcement. He never needed one. There was no entourage pushing people aside. No dramatic pause at the door. He stepped in the way he always did, calm, unhurried, as if the room belonged to time itself, and he was merely passing through it. The pianist noticed first. Then the bartender. Then the laughter began to soften, like waves easing before a tide change. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Dean had that effect. Not because he demanded attention, but because he never chased it. He nodded once to the band, quiet gesture of respect, then took his seat near the back, where the light was low and the truth was clearer. He liked it there. It reminded him of where he came from, rooms smaller than this, crowds tougher than these. Nights when respect wasn't given but earned note by note across the room. A young woman moved between tables with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her name was Clara. No one asked it. No one needed to. To the crowd, she was invisible in the way only the poor become invisible, not unseen but unconsidered. Her dress was clean but faded at the cuffs, her shoes worn thin at the soles. She had learned to walk quietly, to keep her eyes lowered just enough to avoid confrontation. Just enough to survive. But what no one ever noticed, was the way she listened. Clara listened the way musicians do. She heard tone, intention, the spaces between words. She heard lies dressed as jokes. She heard kindness masked as indifference. And tonight, she heard something else, too. Something sharp, careless, and cruel. The man who said it sat near the front. He wore a tailored suit, the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His laugh arrived early and often, filling gaps where thought should have been. He was speaking loudly, performing for the table, for the room, for himself. He wanted to be heard, and then he crossed the line. He didn't shout. He didn't snarl. He smiled. The remark aimed at a legend not present. A man whose voice had once stitched together a fractured country landed with a thud that no one applauded. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't clever. It was an old insult, dressed in a new suit, the kind that relied on silence to survive. A few people laughed out of reflex. Others looked away. One man cleared his throat and reached for his drink. Clara froze. She stood still long enough for the tray to tremble in her hands. Not because she was afraid, but because she recognized the sound. She had heard it before. In kitchens. On buses. In hallways where people spoke as if she weren't there. What surprised her wasn't the insult. It was the silence that followed. Across the room, Dean Martin stopped smiling. He didn't look angry. He didn't look shocked. He looked disappointed. The way a father looks when a lesson fails to take root. The way a man looks when he realizes the world still hasn't learned something it should have learned long ago. Dean took a sip of his drink and set the glass down carefully. Then he stood. No announcement. No drama. Chairs shifted as people noticed. The band paused mid-measure, sensing the change before understanding it. Dean adjusted his jacket knot for effect, but out of habit and began to walk toward the front. Each step quieted the room. The man in the suit noticed too late. He was still smiling when Dean stopped at his table. The smile faded when he realized who was standing there. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult, like he simply spoke. Funny thing about words, he said softly. You don't always hear them when you say them, but the room always does. The man tried to laugh it off. A hand gesture, shrug. The universal language of men who had never been held accountable. Dean didn't budge. I've stood on a lot of stages, continued, his voice steady, conversational. Sang in rooms where men didn't want to hear my name, let alone my voice, and I learned something early. The room leaned in without realizing it. "You can tell the size of a man," Dean said, "by who he thinks it's safe to belittle." Silence. Not the awkward kind. The honest kind. The man opened his mouth, then closed it. Words failed him now. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier had nowhere to go. Dean turned not to the man, but to the room. "To anyone who thinks cruelty is clever," he said, "understand this. Talent doesn't excuse it, money doesn't protect it, and time will not forget it." Then he did something unexpected. He looked at Clara. She startled slightly. Not used to being really seen by men like him. Dean met her eyes, nodded once, and smiled. Not the performer's smile, the human one. "Miss," he said, "would you bring this gentleman a glass of water?" The request was gentle, respectful. Clara nodded and moved, her legs unsteady, but her spine straight. As she passed the table, the man wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the tablecloth like it might offer him a way out. When she returned, Dean was already walking back to his seat. The band resumed, slowly at first, then with confidence. Conversation returned, but it was different now. Quieter, thoughtful. People spoke with care. As if the room itself were listening, Clara set the glass down and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Dignity, not given as charity, acknowledged as fact. She didn't know then that this moment, this quiet correction, would change the course of her life. She didn't know that kindness, when practiced publicly, had a way of rewriting futures. And she certainly didn't know that what happened next, what followed in the days after, would be whispered about, misremembered, and eventually erased from polite history. But Dean Martin knew, as he lifted his glass once more. He glanced toward the empty space beside the stage, the space where his old friend's voice once lived. "Some things," he murmured to himself, "are worth standing up for, even if no one writes them down." The music played on, but the room would never be the same. The city did not talk about what happened that night, not out loud, knew. York had a talent for swallowing moments, especially the uncomfortable ones. By morning, newspapers were busy with safer headlines. Radio hosts joked their way through breakfast hours. The club on West 52nd Street reopened as if nothing had occurred. Tables were wiped clean. Ashtrays emptied. The band rehearsed the same standards, but silence does not mean forgetting. For those who were there, the air had changed. The man in the tailored suit did not return. Not that week. Not the next. His absence was noted quietly by the staff, the way absences always are when someone leaves without dignity. No explanation was offered. None was required, and yet something followed him. Doors closed where they once opened. Invitations slowed. Laughter turned polite, then distant. In rooms where names mattered, his was suddenly said with caution. No accusation ever surfaced. No public reckoning. Just a subtle withdrawal, the kind reserved for men who cross lines everyone pretends not to see. That was the power of what Dean Martin had done. He hadn't humiliated. He hadn't punished. He had exposed. Dean understood something few people did. Cruelty survives noise. It dies in light. Clara noticed the change first in the smallest ways. Customers looked at her longer, not with desire or impatience, but recognition. A nod, a smile, a thank you that lingered an extra second. It confused her at first. She hadn't changed her uniform. Her wages were the same. Her life outside the club was still narrow and uncertain, yet something had shifted. One evening, a man tipped her $5 more than usual and said, "You carry yourself well." Another night, a woman touched her arm gently and whispered, "You did nothing wrong." Clara didn't ask what they meant. She already knew. But what unsettled her most wasn't the kindness, it was the attention from places she didn't expect. The manager, who had once barked orders without looking at her, now watched her closely. Not with suspicion, with calculation. He had seen Dean's nod. He had seen the room react. And he understood the unspoken rule of establishments like his. Reputation traveled faster than truth. Clara became careful. When attention arrives suddenly, it is rarely innocent. Dean Martin, meanwhile, said nothing. He never called a reporter, never told the story on a talk show, never corrected the rumors that drifted through the industry like smoke. Some said he'd threatened the man. Others said he'd forced the club owner to act. A few claimed the entire moment had been exaggerated. Dean let them all talk, because the truth didn't need his voice. It lived in behavior. When he returned to the club weeks later, the room greeted him differently. Respect had always been there, but now it carried weight. Conversations softened when he passed. Musicians straightened their posture. Even the bartender poured with care. Dean took his usual seat. Clara was on shift again. Their eyes met briefly. This time, she didn't look away. Dean noticed. He always noticed. Later that night, during a break between sets, Dean stood and approached the bar. Clara instinctively moved to serve him, hands steady, despite the tremor in her chest. "Easy," Dean said gently. "No rush." She nodded, poured, and slid the glass toward him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he asked, "How long you been working here?" Clara hesitated. Questions from men like him usually came with conditions. Expectations. Assumptions. 2 years, she answered carefully. Dean studied her, not her clothes. Not her posture, but the way she chose her words. The restraint, the intelligence behind caution, and before that. "Wherever would take me," she said. "Wherever didn't ask too many questions?" Dean smiled, not amused, but understanding. "That's usually where the real stories are," he said. She waited. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. "Do you sing?" he asked. The question landed like a dropped glass. Clara's heart skipped. "No," she said quickly. Too quickly, Dean raised an eyebrow, accusing, curious. "You listen like you do." She swallowed. "I used to. A little. When I was younger, everyone used to," Dean said. "Most people just forget why they stopped." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. What Clara didn't know was that Dean had heard something weeks earlier, something not meant for him. A sound technician, half drunk, half brave, had mentioned a girl who sang softly while closing up at night. A voice that carried without effort. A sadness that felt earned. Dean hadn't asked for details. He never rushed these things, but now, standing there, watching Clara measure every word, he understood why that voice hadn't been shared. Talent, when wrapped in poverty, learns to hide, and Dean Martin hated wasted music. Across town, something else was happening. A phone rang in a quiet apartment. The man who had made the remark answered it, expecting reassurance. He got distance instead. A deal postponed. A meeting canceled. An explanation that didn't explain anything. The world hadn't turned against him, but it had turned away. He sat alone longer than he liked, and for the first time, he wondered if words once released ever truly disappeared. Back at the club, the band prepared for the final set. Dean returned to his seat. Clara moved toward the back. She always did when the music started. That was her place. Watching, listening. But tonight, the microphone stood empty between songs. The pianist glanced at Dean. Dean didn't look back. Instead, he looked toward the shadows near the service door. Toward Clara, not with command, with invitation. The room felt it before it happened. A pause, stretched thin, electric. And in that pause, Clara understood something terrifying and beautiful. The silence that followed cruelty was about to be replaced by something else, something that could no longer be erased. The pause lasted longer than it should have. Music rooms were not built for silence. They survived on rhythm, expectation, and release. Yet the club stood frozen, glasses half raised. Breaths held as the empty microphone waited under the spotlight. Ate like a question no one dared to ask aloud. Clara felt it in her chest, before she understood it in her mind. This was not a mistake. This was not coincidence. Across the room, Dean Martin leaned back in his chair. one arm resting casually as if he hadn't just tilted the entire room off its axis. He didn't point. He didn't wave. He simply looked, steady, patient, certain. The pianist's fingers hovered over the keys. It's uncertain whether to fill the silence or honor it. The band exchanged glances. The audience shifted, confused but alert. Someone whispered, "What's happening?" Clara's legs felt heavy. Every instinct told her to stay where she was. To disappear back into the safety of shadows and service doors. People like her were not invited into spotlights. They were tolerated around them, but something else rose in her quiet. Stubborn, undeniable. A memory her mother humming while washing dishes in a cramped apartment. A borrowed radio. A song played low so neighbors wouldn't complain. A voice told to be softer, smaller. As Clara took one step forward, the manager noticed immediately. He straightened, eyes sharp, calculating risk. This was not on the schedule. This was not approved. He started to move, then stopped when he saw Dean Martin. Watching him, not threatening. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to step aside. Clara reached the edge of the light. The microphone felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than sound. She wrapped her fingers around it, palms damp, heart racing. The room waited not kindly, not cruelly, but with curiosity sharpened into suspense. She swallowed. I'm not supposed to do this," she said softly. Her voice carried anyway. A murmur rippled through the room. A few smiles flickered uncertain, amused. Others leaned forward. Something about her tone demanded attention. Dean didn't react. That steadiness grounded her. "I don't have training," she continued. "I don't have connections. I listen. And sometimes I remember." She closed her eyes. The pianist, instinctive and brave, touched a single key, low, gentle, a question rather than a chord. Clara answered it. She didn't sing loudly. She didn't perform. She told the truth in melody. Her voice wasn't perfect. It was better than that. It carried years of restraint, nights of hunger, mornings of quiet resolve. It bent around the room, settling into corners where laughter once lived. People stopped breathing, eh? A woman near the front wiped her eyes without realizing why. A man who'd come to impress a date forgot himself entirely. The bartender froze mid-pour, liquid spilling unnoticed. Dean Martin watched not as a judge, not as a star, but as a man recognizing something rare. The song ended without flourish, no dramatic note. No demand for applause, just silence. Then slowly someone clapped. One hand. Then another. The applause grew, not explosive but reverent, like the room understood this wasn't entertainment. It was witness. Clara opened her eyes, stunned. She hadn't planned to cry, but tears came anyway. She stepped back instinctively. Ready to vanish again? Dean stood. The room hushed at once. He walked to the microphone, not to take it, but to stand beside it. "Some voices," he said calmly. "Don't get heard, because they're not loud enough." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Clara. "They don't get heard because they're not invited." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room, not anger. "Recognition," Dean continued. "What you just heard wasn't talent looking for approval. It was truth waiting for permission." He looked directly at the manager now. "And truth," he added, "doesn't need credentials." The manager nodded stiffly. He knew better than to argue. Dean turned back to the crowd. "Enjoy the music." "Hey," he said simply. Then he stepped away. Just like that. No announcement. No endorsement. No promise, but the damage to indifference was done. What happened next was never officially recorded. There were no cameras. No contracts signed that night. No press release. Just conversations that ended early. Drinks left unfinished. People leaving the club quieter than they arrived, and behind-the-scenes pressure began to build. The club owner received a call the next morning, then another. Questions disguised as compliments. "Interesting talent," they said. "Unexpected, you planning to feature her?" The owner hesitated because attention is a double-edged thing. It can elevate or destroy. Clara returned to work the following night, unsure of everything. Whispers followed her now, some admiring, some resentful, a few dangerous. She overheard words like attention, trouble, disruption. Opportunity always frightens systems built on predictability. Dean Martin did not return that evening or the next. And that absence more than his presence made people nervous, because it raised a question no one wanted to answer. Was what happened a moment or a challenge? Across town, a different conversation took place. A producer, old school, cautious, powerful, listened as a trusted friend described the scene. The song, the silence. Dean's words. The producer leaned back, thoughtful. Dangerous, he said finally. Beautiful. The producer sighed. Those two things rarely coexist without consequences. Stared at the ceiling. There are stories, he added, that change people, and stories institutions prefer to forget. By the end of the week, Clara was called into the office. The door closed softly behind her. On the desk sat a single piece of paper. Not a contract, a decision. And outside, the city kept moving, unaware that a moment it would never fully remember was about to demand a price. The paper on the desk was thin, so thin it felt almost fragile between Clara's fingers, as if the words printed on it might dissolve if she held them too tightly. She didn't read it at first. She already knew what it would say, not because anyone had told her, but because the room itself carried that kind of tension. The office smelled of old wood and nervous decisions. The manager sat across from her, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. He had practiced this look. Clara could tell. It was the look of a man who believed he was being fair. Even as he chose safety over courage. You put us in a difficult position, he said finally. Clara lifted her eyes. I didn't ask to sing, she replied quietly. No, he admitted, but it happened, and now people are talking. There it was, not what she did, but what it caused. The manager leaned forward. This place survives on balance, expectations, certain understandings. Clara nodded slowly. She understood systems very well. She had lived beneath them her entire life. Being let go, she said. The manager hesitated just long enough to convince himself he was kind. We're saying it's mutual, he replied. Clara folded the paper once, then again, precise, controlled. Thank you, she said, standing. The manager blinked. He had expected anger, tears, bargaining. What he got instead unsettled him more. Dignity outside. The city greeted her without ceremony. Taxis honked. People rushed past. Somewhere, a radio played a song she recognized, but could no longer sing along with. Her job was gone. Her routine erased. The thin stability she'd fought to maintain had vanished in a single afternoon, and yet she felt lighter because something else remained, her voice. That evening, Clara walked. She didn't know where she was going. She just kept moving, letting the city decide her direction. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, she found herself outside a small, aging theater, dark, closed. Forgotten by most, a man stood nearby, smoking, older, worn. Watching the building like it held memories he hadn't made peace with. You lost? He asked. Clara shook her head. Just listening. The man smiled faintly. That's how it starts. He introduced himself as someone who fixed lights when no one was watching. Someone who had seen talent arrive early and leave broken. Someone who had heard what happened at the club. You sang, he said. Clara stiffened. I heard, he added quickly. Not the song. The moment. She studied him carefully. Why didn't anyone stop it? He shrugged. Because moments like that scare people who profit from order. He flicked the cigarette away. But not everyone. Across town. Dean Martin sat alone in a quiet room. A phone rested untouched on the table beside him. He had received the calls. Offers disguised as concern. Requests wrapped in compliments. She's good, they said. But maybe not right for now. Timing matters. The audience isn't ready. Dean listened. Then he declined every single one. Not out of spite, out of principle. Some doors, he believed, should not be forced open. Some stories deserve to live without being shaped into something smaller. When asked later why he didn't intervene more directly, Dean answered only once, because saving someone and standing with them are not the same thing. Weeks passed. The city forgot. No headlines recorded Clara's name. No archive preserved the silence after her song. The club continued. New acts arrived. The moment was reduced to rumor, then memory, then nothing at all. History moved on. But history, for all its arrogance, does not decide everything. Clara found work again, this time at the old theater. At first, she swept floors, replaced bulbs, learned which boards creaked and which doors stuck. At night, when the building emptied, she sang softly to the seats. She never chased applause. She let the room listen. The man with the lights taught her things. Not about fame, but about craft. About patience. About choosing when not to be seen. One night a handful of people stayed late. Another night more returned. They didn't advertise. They didn't record. They just listened years later. Someone would ask Dean Martin if he regretted not turning that night into something bigger. He smiled. No, he said. Some truths don't need witnesses. They need continuation. Clara never became famous. She became certain, and in the quiet spaces history failed to document. Her voice continued unedited, and free. That is what they erased, and that is what survived.